immediately claiming central territory, preparing for rapid piece development and an open game. Setting the stage for a solid Caro-Kann defense, preparing to challenge the center with a pawn. Developing the knight here immediately stakes a claim on d5 and prepares for a central pawn push. Immediately challenging the center opens up lines and creates dynamic imbalances, a hallmark of aggressive play. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the e4 pawn and prepares for castling, aiming for swift kingside safety and piece harmony. Developing the bishop to pin the knight immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and seeks active piece play. Aggressively challenging the pinned bishop immediately, this move preemptively addresses potential tactics while gaining a little breathing room for the king. Sacrificing the bishop here opens lines for your pieces and forces white to double their pawns, creating a strategic weakness. Unleashing the queen now, white aims to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and open lines for their monarch's eventual safety. Developing the knight to f6 offers defensive support to the d5 pawn and prepares for castling, a logical step in solidifying black's pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, white gracefully retreats their queen and advances a pawn to reinforce their central structure, a quiet but crucial step in developing a robust pawn chain and potentially opening lines for future attacking play. Solidifying the pawn structure, black prepares to develop the kingside bishop and connect the rooks, aiming for a balanced middle game where pieces can operate harmoniously. Proactively securing the queenside advance, white prevents any immediate tactical jabs and prepares for a gradual queenside buildup, though this commits a tempo to a pawn move that doesn't directly challenge black's central presence. Nurturing the knight's position on d7 prepares its eventual transfer to a more active square, perhaps f6 or even e5, while bolstering the central pawn structure. Gambiting space on the kingside signals an aggressive intent, but it also creates potential weaknesses. Consider how this pawn push might compromise your king's safety and whether the long-term positional cost is worth the immediate territorial gain. Developing the bishop to d6 reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares to castle kingside, creating a more secure pawn shield for the king. Boldly pushing the pawn forward, white immediately challenges the black knight and aims to seize more central territory, though it does create a slight weakness on the kingside by opening the h-file. This aggressive pawn advance forces a reaction from black and significantly alters the pawn structure, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game where king safety might become a crucial factor. Retreating the knight all the way back to g8, while seemingly passive, addresses the immediate pressure on the f6 square and aims to reposition for future central control or a kingside defense, acknowledging the compromised pawn structure and avoiding further tactical skirmishes for now. Pushing that pawn further accentuates white's overwhelming space advantage on the kingside, a potent springboard for future attacks, though it simultaneously weakens the light squares around your monarch. The knight's retreat to e7 is a calculated repositioning, aiming to solidify black's central structure and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside. This maneuver subtly shifts the focus away from the immediate kingside skirmishes, seeking to develop a more robust defensive shield while keeping options open for future development. It's a nuanced response to white's aggressive pawn push, prioritizing stability over immediate confrontation. Opening a bold path towards the enemy king, this pawn thrust aggressively claims more space on the kingside and potentially prepares a decisive advance with the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses around their monarch. Challenging the central pawn's advance, this maneuver redirects the queen to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn storm and potentially create counterplay down the b-file. Initiating an aggressive kingside pawn storm, white's bishop now tucks itself away on a square that, while seemingly passive, subtly supports the advancing pawns and prepares for potential future piece activity along the h3-c8 diagonal, all while avoiding immediate trades and maintaining a flexible structure against black's queenside pressure. Embracing the dark side of the board, black dramatically castles queenside, throwing down the gauntlet for a wild, open confrontation. This bold decision immediately sets the stage for a pawn storm race towards the opposing monarchs. White's kingside pawn advance 8, g4 and 9. g5 now looks a bit premature, as black's castling opens up the c-file for potential counterplay against white's now somewhat exposed king. The piece coordination on black's queenside, with the rook on c8, knight on d7, and queen on b6, hints at an imminent thrust, perhaps targeting the c2 pawn or even the b-pawn, creating chaos. White must now be extremely careful not to get outmaneuvered, as the pawn structure on the kingside, while advanced, could become a liability if black's queenside attack gains traction. Opening up the queenside prematurely, white gambles on a quick breakthrough, but this pawn push weakens the queenside structure and potentially creates targets for black's pieces, especially the queen once it repositions. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, black opts for a5, anticipating white's pawn advance on the queenside with a4 and aiming to prevent any immediate further encroachments there, potentially creating a stable barrier against white's g-pawn's relentless march towards the kingside. Fortifying the king's sanctuary initiates the centralizing of white's forces, aiming to solidify the defensive perimeter against potential pawn pushes on the kingside. With rhf8, black initiates a crucial regrouping, aiming to activate the rooks and potentially challenge the pawn structure white has aggressively constructed on the kingside. This maneuver signals a shift in black's plan, moving away from passive defense and towards a more active counterplay, possibly preparing to contest the central files or even launch an attack on white's now somewhat exposed king. The rook's journey to f8, while seemingly simple, is a deep positional commitment that could dictate the flow of the game for many moves to come. Prioritizing king safety, this maneuver tucks the monarch away from the central e-file's influence and prepares a potential escape route via g2 if the queenside pressure intensifies. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, 15. f5 initiates a daring counterstrike, aiming to shatter white's kingside pawn structure and pry open lines towards the enemy monarch, a bold declaration of intent amidst the cramped queenside maneuvering. Pivoting the queen from the central d-file to the g-file aims to support the aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, while simultaneously eyeing potential weaknesses around black's awkwardly placed king, now castled on the queenside. This queen repositioning subtly reinforces the g5 pawn and prepares for future pawn advances like g6, threatening to overwhelm black's defenses and create open lines for white's pieces. Intensifying the pawn storm on the king's side, black seeks to undermine white's attacking structure, though this aggressively opens the way for white's queen and bishop to exploit the now exposed dark squares around black's monarch. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively pushes the h-pawn, aiming to pry open the kingside and exploit the defender's slightly awkward piece placement. This audacious advance creates immediate spatial pressure, forcing black to confront the encroaching white soldier and potentially compromising the integrity of their monarch's shelter. The long-term consequences of this bold pawn thrust will undoubtedly hinge on black's ability to counter the mounting threats and prevent a catastrophic breakdown of their defenses. Steering the king to b8 now offers some respite, tucking it away from the developing threats along the now open h-file and creating a more secure perimeter on the queenside for the impending structural clashes. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, f4 aims to shatter black's defensive wall and exploit the exposed king, but opens up the g-file for potential counterplay. A stabilizing retreat for the rook, seeking safety on the open file and reinforcing the e-pawn's defense against the queenside advances. The central advance 19. e5 boldly injects a pawn into the heart of the position, immediately contesting black's d5 square and threatening to unravel the pawn structure. This aggressive gambit aims to create immediate complications and potentially open lines for white's pieces, particularly the queen and bishops. It's a bold statement of intent, seeking to seize the initiative and exploit any hesitations in black's rather passive setup. Observe how this pawn's presence now alters the dynamics of the d-file and challenges black's king's central security. Securing the outpost on c5 offers the bishop a more active diagonal, aiming to exploit the slight structural weaknesses white has created on the queen side. An attempt to reclaim the initiative after black's solidifying setup, this queen repositioning eyes the long diagonal, and prepares for potential pawn thrusts on the kingside, aiming to break down black's now rather compact defenses and find weaknesses in the pawn structure. Bypassing the expected pawn push, black opts for a subtle repositioning, rerouting the knight to a more harmonious square on c8 where it can potentially support an advance on the queenside or bolster the defense of the castled king by contesting the c-file. Shifting the bishop to g2 aims to secure it behind the pawn chain, potentially preparing for a future kingside pawn storm or simply ensuring its safety from the c5 square's influence. Shifting the king to c7 is a defensive maneuver, aiming to consolidate the monarch's position behind the pawn chain and potentially escape the increasingly open lines on the queenside where white's pawn advanced menacingly. This repositioning also prepares for a more active rook roll, perhaps on the c-file, if circumstances allow. Sharpening the knight's reach, knee, aims to bolster the kingside defenses while potentially clearing a path for the other knight to join the fray on the queenside, orchestrating a more balanced presence across the board. Re-establishing contact with the queenside, the knight retreats to a more defensive square, preparing to potentially support an eventual c5 pawn break or to find a new post on the c6 or d7 squares, a sensible repositioning given white's aggressive pawn advances and the exposed nature of black's king. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, white aims to counter black's initiative by creating a more robust defensive shield for their king and potentially preparing for a queenside pawn storm of their own, aiming to restrict black's bishops. Initiating a dangerous kingside advance without adequate support, black now seeks to regroup on the queenside and potentially activate the rook. But this endeavor comes at the cost of neglecting their already precarious central position and exposing the king to further scrutiny. Consolidating the bishop to a more active square, this maneuver aims to enhance piece coordination and potentially prepare for a pawn advance on the kingside, leveraging the diagonal previously vacated by black's misplaced knight. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the c5 and d4 squares while potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or preparing for a queenside counterplay. Preparing to contest the open b-file, white signals a shift in focus, aiming to pry open lines for queenside pressure and potentially create a passed pawn later. A necessary retreat to preserve the bishop's influence, as its previous diagonal was becoming untenable under white's growing pawn presence on the kingside. Unlocking the queenside and disrupting black's precarious pawn structure, this pawn thrust aims to seize initiative by creating attacking chances. Gambling on an open file to disrupt the queenside pawn structure, this capture initiates a complex series of exchanges where black hopes to gain initiative by forcing white's pieces into awkward positions, potentially creating weaknesses around the monarch. Opening the c-file after black's ambitious pawn sacrifice immediately transforms the tactical landscape, creating immediate pressure on the queenside and forcing black to reconsider their rook's passive placement on f8. Seizing the open diagonal, black forcefully reclaims material, disrupting white's pawn structure and opening up avenues for counterplay that were previously non-existent. The pawn's audacious lunge disrupts black's modest pawn chain, creating immediate tactical fireworks. The black queen, having found a surprisingly active outpost on c5, now directly challenges white's queenside expansion, aiming to disrupt the carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses around white's king. Initiating a central pawn push to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. Re-establishing the queen's central presence is a sensible decision after the pawn advances. The knight's retreat to the queenside was necessary, but left the queen as the primary defender of the king's weakened structure. The queen's bishop is finally being exchanged, clearing a path for the rook on the b-file and disrupting black's already awkward piece placement. Recapturing with the knight ignites a fascinating positional struggle. Black seeks to leverage the isolated doubled pawns on the queenside and the open c-file for counterplay, while white endeavors to consolidate their central space and utilize the powerful light-squared bishop on g2 to pressure the weakened black king. This knight maneuver, though seemingly passive, opens up avenues for counterattack and disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn chain, forcing a re-evaluation of white's attacking plans. The board's geometry transforms as the queenside pawns become potential targets, and the knight eyes key squares, promising dynamic developments ahead. A calculated retreat to clear the way for a central pawn thrust and potential piece redistribution. Re-engaging the knight to the queenside opens a vital diagonal for black's queen, but it also sacrifices control of the important c5 square, potentially allowing white's queen to exploit that weakness and create attacking chances. Unleashing a devastating knight sacrifice, white exploits the exposed black king and creates a potent mating attack by forcing open the file for the rook, aiming to shatter the queenside pawn structure and overwhelm the beleaguered monarch. The knight's retreat to c7 surrenders the crucial d5 outpost, a concession that grants white significant central control and opens lines for further infiltration. Reactivating the knight to its original square suggests a desire to reroute it towards the queenside or perhaps to support a pawn advance there, aiming to break open lines. Re-establishing the knight on a more active square is a sensible regrouping, aiming to get it off the vulnerable back rank and towards the central action, a welcome change of scenery from its passive sentinel duty on b8. Unlocking the file with the rook's assistance initiates a potent assault on black's beleaguered queenside.